In this video, we're talking about flavor profiles right here on the Tequila Hombre, coming up next. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Tequila Hombre, where today we're going to be talking about flavor profiles. Now, one of the things that people have asked me a lot in the comments and questions that they send to me every day is how can a distillery produce so many different flavor profiles or so many different brands and have them be different? And the devil's in the details with that, and that has to do with creating flavor profiles. Now, it was funny because recently I was having a discussion with a distillery owner, master distiller, and I was talking to them, and they're like, Mark, we get a lot of people that give us flack, that say we're producing too many brands, that we're going to be diluting our reputation, and that too many brands have the same flavor profile because they just don't understand what we do and how we do it. And so I was thinking this would be a great video for you guys. So get out your pens and papers, and we're going to talk about flavor profile development and how it works in the tequila industry. Now, just to be upfront and honest about this, there are some distilleries that just produce a single profile and then sell it to different brands and do different things to kind of tweak that profile a little bit, or even just give them the same profile and maybe use additives to create a different flavor profile. But a lot of distilleries out there that are the kinds that I focus on, the traditionally made, master distillers have been doing it for 4 generations, don't do that. Instead, they do create individual flavor profiles for the different brands that they produce, the contract brands. So we're going to get into details about how they do this. So put your learning ears on, grab a pen and paper, and let's get to learning about tequila flavor profiles. So, of course, the first step in creating a tequila brand is selecting your agave. Now, one of the things that a lot of the tequileros or even agaveros have told me when I've sit down with them is they can actually create different flavor profiles depending on where they harvest their agave. So, for example, I was talking to one agavero / tequilero master distiller, and he was telling me that if a brand comes to him and says they want a certain flavor profile, he can harvest agave from many different areas within his agave fields. He said some of his areas actually have like red soil that produces one flavor profile, black soil that produces another flavor profile, and even mineral rich kind of white soil that produces a different flavor profile. And then they can also look at the age of the agave, if it's 8 years and extremely ripe and lots of starches and sugars in that puppy, or one that's 5 to 6 years old that maybe doesn't have as high a brix, but will produce a different flavor profile. So the first element they look at is the agave and where they harvest it from and what kind of flavored profile that particular agave will generate. So agave selection is the first key in selecting and creating a flavor profile for a tequila brand. Now, of course, we all have heard too that altitude actually also affects the flavor profile of the agave. But one of the things after they harvest the agave, one of the things that also can affect the flavor profile is the hema on the agave. So how they actually trim the agave with the koa, and whether they leave more penca or less penca, shave it down to the actual piña itself with no penca. There's a lot of ways they can hema it to also change the flavor profile depending on what the client wants and what kind of flavor profile they want to generate for that particular tequila. Now, while agave and where they harvest it from is important, it has a minute effect on actually the flavor profile of the tequila. Probably somewhere around 10% of the flavor profile comes from the actual agave. So after they harvest this agave, they then have to cook it. So different cooking methods produce different flavor profiles. They can use a brick Orno, which of course a brick Orno will generate its own flavor profile. And some of that has to do with the residuals that's left in the brick that's in the particular brick Orno. So there's some residuals from previous batches that are in there, and those all affect the flavor profile. Now, they can also use an autoclave, and some distilleries actually have brick ovens and autoclaves. So depending on what the customer wants, they can pick the cook that they think will give the best flavor profile for what that particular brand is looking for. Now, with an autoclave, autoclaves tend to focus more on the pure agave taste because they're so easy to clean and get immaculate. And then they also cook the same way as a brick Orno does, using steam. There's nothing bad with autoclaves at all. Some of the best tequila brands out there are made with autoclaves. So it depends on how long they cook the agave as well. So if they use a brick orno or they use an autoclave, they can cook it for longer to try to get more caramelized sugars in there, which additionally affects the flavor profile. So cook has something to do with the flavor profile as well. And that's probably another 10% of the flavor profile. So far, the selection of the agave is 10% and the cooking is 10%. So let's move on to the next phase, which is extraction. All right, so now we're at extraction. The agave are cooked. Everything's smelling really great. We got flies and bees flying everywhere in the distillery. So now we need to think about extraction. Now there's 3 tools that are used primarily in the tequila industry for extraction. We're going to talk about the 2 ones that traditional brands use. The other one is a diffuser. We're not going to talk about diffuser in this episode, but we're going to talk about the Taona and the roller mill. Now, the Taona, of course, uses either, if you're Felipe Camarena, it uses a stainless steel steam roller wheel that's been repurposed, which will not, impose any additional flavors on the actual agave and stuff. But if they use a stone wheel, a stone Taona wheel, that can impart a minerality on the flavor profile. And that's one of the reasons why like Tequila Ocho does not use a Taona for it. They use a roller mill because they didn't want the stone wheel imposing flavor profiles on it. They wanted it to be strictly about the agave. So there they use the roller mill. Since roller mills are made of stainless steel and are extremely easy to clean, they tend to not affect the flavor profile at all. So they will extract the sugars from the agave fibers and create what's called mosto. Now with the Taona wheel, since the Taona wheel rolls around on most of the time it's like a brick surface, they will use some of the rock, some of the minerality from the volcanic rock they use for a Taona wheel will impart a minerality to the actual flavor profile. So if somebody's looking for a little more minerality in it, more like traditional flavor profile, they can use a Taona wheel and it will impart a little minerality. If they want to just highlight the agave and have it be more of a clean tequila, then they'll go roller mill with stainless steel and it'll extract the sugars without imposing any flavors on the flavor profile itself. So extraction's probably about 2.5 to 5% on the flavor profile. So now you're kind of getting an idea too of how tequila is made through the different steps and what they look at. So the next step, after of course they find the right agave, harvest it, trim it right, cook it the way they want to cook it, get the nice caramelized sugars that they're looking for depending on the time and the temperature that they cook at. And then they extract the sugars out of the agave fibers using either a roller mill or Taona, which imparts a little bit of flavor profile depending on what they have there at the distillery. Some distilleries still have Taonas and roller mills and will switch between the two depending on what flavor profile they want. Some distilleries are actually adding Taonas to increase their spectrum of what kind of flavor profiles they can actually produce. So then we're going on to fermentation, and then fermentation is a big part of creating the flavor profile. So we're going to talk a little bit about things that they can look at during fermentation to really affect the flavor profile of the tequila. All right, so the first important part that they look at when they're heading into fermentation is the yeast selection. Now, are they going to go natural yeast that's already on the agave, that's native to the agave plant, and let that do its work? Or are they going to select a different yeast like champagne yeast, or even some distilleries use bread yeast? And depending on the yeast that they select, it will create a different flavor profile, the way it ferments and how it works. So for example, there's some yeast out there that create a diacetyl type of byproduct during fermentation. And with a diacetyl type compound coming from the yeast, it will create a buttery kind of flavor profile. So when you have had a tequila that kind of you would kind of say is buttery, that's diacetyl from a certain kind of yeast that creates that diacetyl element. Now, there's different things that they can look at in the yeast, how well it ferments, how high it can go in alcohol content. So some of them will stop fermenting at a certain alcohol level, certain ABV within the mosto. Some work within different temperature ranges. And so they can select it based on how they're going to ferment and what they plan on doing during the fermentation process. All right, I'm throwing a lot of information at you really quick here, so hopefully you're writing it down or taking notes. If not, you can always go back and review this again and get the additional information that you missed out on. So after they selected what yeast they want to use, then it's important for them to understand the profile of the yeast, how the yeast works, what temperature zone it ferments best at, what kind of flavor profiles, what kind of things it creates. Does it create byproducts like diacetyl, which will give it a buttery flavor profile, or is it more of a cleaner? Will it give it kind of a doughy flavor profile? Those are the kind of things that they need to understand about the yeast before they select it. Now, the thing that's kind of really interesting is there's like hundreds of different species of yeast that they can use to create a different flavor profile within the distillery for the brands that they're working with. So temperatures are really important as well, knowing the temperature range. And when I talked to one master distiller, one of the things he told me, he said is optimum temperature, that he thinks he gets the best distillation or the best fermentation with the yeast that he uses is at 10 degrees Celsius. And 10 degrees Celsius is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So he thinks he produces a cleaner, better distillate, a better tequila when he ferments at 50 degrees Celsius, which is primarily, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is primarily in the wintertime or in the early spring. And so for his distillery, he says he really loves producing during that time because he really produces some amazing clean tequila. In the summer, it produces a different flavor profile because you're pushing the yeast a little bit hotter than what it likes to be at, and so it'll create different flavors as well, different flavor notes and things that can also contribute to the flavor profile. Now, fermentation is extremely important, and it represents around 70% of the flavor profile. So they really, in order to really make a difference, they really need to pay attention to fermentation and how it works. Now, of course, some distilleries will use playing classical music like Mozart and stuff to get the yeast excited and do things like that. And so some distilleries too find different things that they can do with the mosto and with the environment to affect the fermentation. And so that's different things that they can do to create different unique flavor profiles during fermentation. All right, so here we are creating a brand. We're working on our flavor profile. We selected the agave that we like, that we think is going to give us the flavor profile we want. We've had it HEMA to the right way. We have enough pink on there to give us the kind of flavor profile we're looking for as well, that the Agavero and Master Tequilero had determined for us. Then we've cooked the agave in either a brick orno or autoclave to get that caramelized sugars and stuff that we want to create the flavor profile we want. We've then used an extraction tool, whether it's a Taona or a roller mill, to extract the sugars. And then we've got that mosto, the beautiful agave syrup that comes out from the agave fibers, and we fermented it using a certain type of yeast at a certain temperature zone that we really like, that's going to create the flavor profile that we're looking for. So what's next, right? Well, next it goes into distillation, and cuts makes a big part. It has a big contribution to the flavor profile, and that's probably an additional 10%, 15% of the flavor profile comes from the cuts. And so the cuts has to do with how much heads you select, how much corazon, the hearts, and then of course how deep you go into the colas or the tails. So let me kind of explain how this works. Normally your high alcohols come out at the beginning of the distillation, and those tend to have a lot of your flavor in it. Okay, that's where a lot of your flavor elements come from. Of course, they will throw out, there's tends to be some methanol in the heads. Some master distillers don't discard the heads at all. They just keep the heads in there because they said there's not enough methanol really to cause any problems, but there's a lot of flavor elements that they like that can help contribute to the flavor profile. So then your hearts is more of your pure alcohol part. And that's when somebody says it's all corazones, it's all the pure alcohol part of the distillation. And then the tails tends to lean more into more methanol. And you can actually, if you go too far into the tails, you can get some off flavors, like even like wet cardboard type of flavors that come from the colas. So you need to watch how far you cut into the colas to dictate what kind of flavor profile you're going to get. Now, they do collect the heads in a separate bin. Sometimes they collect the colas in a separate bin, and they collect the corazon, and then they'll blend them to get the particular flavor profile you want. Now, also, the still does make a difference in distillation. So whether they use a all copper still, if they use a stainless steel still with no copper in it at all, or if they use a stainless steel still with a copper coil. Now, copper tends to sometimes leach a little metallic taste, into the tequila itself. But the nice thing about copper is it does react with some of the elements within it, and to clean up the tequila and give it a cleaner flavor profile. And so you can actually, if you've ever opened up a still, you can actually see blue material inside of it. And that's from the chemical reaction that happens between the copper and the nitrates that are actually within the tequila. If you don't do that, then you can use stainless steel and it'll ferment just beautifully as well. Sometimes they use stainless steel and they put a copper coil in it. So it does have some reaction with the copper to clean everything up. But sometimes copper, like I said, can leach a little metallic taste into the tequila, which will also affect the flavor profile and give it a little bit of a metallic mineral flavor profile to it. All right, so we harvested the right agave, we coated it right, we cooked it right, we used the extraction tool that we wanted to create the flavor profile we're looking at. We fermented it the way we wanted to, we distilled it the way we wanted to, and now we have a Blanco tequila, and we're going to taste that Blanco and go, yes, okay, this tastes really good. Or we could say, you know, it's still a little bit raw in its young phase. And so one thing that we can do with this particular Blanco is rest it. We can put it in a stainless steel tank or a glass tank and let it sit for a little while and let those flavors kind of marry and let the thing kind of settle down a little bit, because distillation is kind of a rough method in itself, in that you take alcohol, you turn it into a vapor, and then you condense it back into a liquid form. It's kind of rough on the molecules. So by letting it sit and rest, it can help the flavor profile a little bit. So if they give it a rest, it can produce one flavor profile. If you just put it straight into the bottle, it'll give you a different flavor profile. So that has some effect on the flavor as well. But after you've got your Blanco ready and you're ready to say, okay, let's look at some aging. So, because we want to do a Repo and a Añejo, what kind of flavor profile do we want for our aged tequilas? So let's look at that next. So after we have our Blanco ready to go, we're ready to age it. We're ready to make a Repo and Añejo and extra Añejo, and we want to create a certain flavor profile with that. So barrel selection is key when you're looking at your aged spirits. So do you want to use French oak? Do you want to use American oak? Do you want to use Hungarian oak? There's different kind of oak barrels you can select, you can choose. And then also, do I want to use a previously used barrel? So do I want something that's been aged bourbon, and do I want a bourbon influence on it? Do I want a Tennessee whiskey influence on it? Do I want a Scotch whiskey influence on it? Do I want a rum influence on it? Do I want a wine influence on it? And so the possibilities are endless, and we're seeing a lot of experimental batches or a lot of new batches coming out, special limited batches coming out using different types of barrels that house different types of alcohol in it previously, whether it's wine, whether it's a spirit, whether it's even beer. Even they've actually used some beer barrels as well. So depending on what you select, depending on what you're looking for, you'll select the right barrel and you'll fill it with your Blanco and start the aging process. Now, temperature in which it ages is also key and important, because you want to cut down on evaporation, losing the devil's cut and the angel's share as well. So you want to keep an eye on that and make sure you're not losing alcohol, but losing instead water, because you want water evaporation. So in that kind of scenario, you want the humidity to be a little bit lower. When the humidity is lower, you'll lose water, but you'll gain alcohol content in it as it ages and the angels take their share. Where if it's more humid in there, you'll lose more alcohol, and you'll actually lose the ABV the longer it ages within the barrels. Now, since all barrels aren't created equal, there's some barrels, even if they're like Jack Daniels. Let's say we have an American oak barrel that Jack Daniels was aged in, and I've got 6 American oak Jack Daniels barrels that I'm filling with Blanco tequila for a reposado. Each one of those barrels is going to taste completely different after, let's say we let it go for 6 months. Each one of those barrels is going to taste completely different. So it's imperative that the distillery that you're working with have somebody that's good at blending them together to create the flavor profile that you find most appealing. So they'll go through, they'll taste from each barrel, they'll see what kind of flavor profile they're getting from each barrel, and then they'll blend them to make sure that they get the flavor profile that you're particularly looking for, and creating a unique and wonderful flavor profile for your brand. So by taking all of these elements that we talked about in this video and taking them into consideration and changing different aspects of each of them, a distillery could realistically create hundreds, if not thousands, of different flavor profiles from using the same ingredients that goes into all tequila, but just selected from different areas, different methods of cooking, different methods of crushing, different methods of fermentation, different yeast profiles, different cuts and distillation. And basically it's a blank canvas. They can create all kinds of different wonderful flavor profiles. And that's why some distilleries, you can actually go through and taste all their brands, and none of them will taste identical to each other. They're all unique in their own way, because the good master distillers know that the devil's in the details when they're looking at stuff like this. And the more close attention they pay to details, the better the tequila will be, and the more different flavor profiles they can create. Well, there you go. Hopefully this information in this video will give you a broader understanding of how these distilleries can create 30 or 40 different brands of tequila out of their distillery and not duplicate the same flavor profile. There's different things that they can do. And I know this because I do work with some people on creating flavor profiles for new brands, as well as working with some distilleries on changing flavor profiles to create special editions. If you like the information I provided in this video, make sure you click the thumbs up and give me a like. If you're new to the channel and you like learning stuff like this, make sure you click that subscribe button and the notification bell next to it. And not only will you get great informational content like this that will help you, but we'll also do some reviews too, and kind of give you an idea of what tequilas out there I particularly like, and you can determine whether it's something you want to try or not, which will lead you to tasting and enjoying better tequila. And like I always say, life is too short to drink bad tequila, so find the right distillery that pays attention to the devil in the details and creates fantastic tequila following these processes, and you'll be in great shape. Salud. Bye, guys.